And friends, our scripture lesson today is taken from the Gospel according to Mark, chapter 7, verses 24 through 37. From there he set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there, yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syrophoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." So she went home, found the child lying on the bed, and the demon gone. Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went by way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee, in the region of the Decapolis. They brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. He took him aside in private away from the crowd and put his fingers into his ears, and he spat and touched his tongue. Then looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, "Ephphatha," that is, "be opened." And immediately his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one, but the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. They were astounded beyond measure, saying, "He has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." Well, with school starting for many of you, how many of you have a day planner that kind of looks like this picture over my shoulder? I mean, we get so busy, and I know that for a lot of you parents, the start of school just makes things even busier. But when your calendar is that packed, what do you do if something comes up? How do you respond? Do you have the ability to respond? In our story this week, which is actually a couple of stories, Jesus is continually getting interrupted when what he's trying to do is get away. See, it says that he entered a house. He had gone away to this region that's a little further out, and he goes to a house and he doesn't want anyone to know he was there, okay? He was trying to hide from the crowds who were trying to come to him, and yet he wasn't able to be anonymous. And a woman approaches him in the first of our healing stories. And what I'm going to do with these two stories is I see them as kind of operating in parallel. So I'm kind of going to go between both of them as we see the features that are common to each of them. And the first one is simply that Jesus is trying to not be seen by the crowds when a woman approaches him because she needs her daughter to be healed. And this woman happens to not be Jewish. She's a Gentile. And that factors into the response that Jesus gives her. Now, in the other story, which is the story of a deaf man who needs healing, we see that Jesus also wants to get away. And so what happens is that when this person's friends beg Jesus to heal him, Jesus takes this man aside in private, away from the crowd. So again, he's trying to get away from people. He doesn't want people to see what he's doing. He's now been interrupted twice. And clearly, these interruptions are not helping the way that he reacts. Because to get back to the story of the woman who interrupted him, he responds to her using language that isn't very polite. He says to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." And the comparison to dogs is really insulting. It's particularly insulting in that culture, okay? It's something that to this day you don't do in the Middle East. You don't associate people with dogs. And what he's saying to her is that his mission, his task, what was right in front of him, what's in his day planner, was to bring the message to the Jewish people. And she's not Jewish. She's a Gentile. She's not in his plans. And Jesus is frustrated that his schedule is being upset. He's also frustrated that the deaf man has been brought to him, further complicating what he was trying to do. Because it says that when he healed the deaf man, he sighed. It's an interesting observation, made even more interesting when you understand that the word for sighed in Greek kind of implies grumbled. Has that ever happened to you? It's not a happy word. It's the kind of word that happens when you are just slammed and someone comes to you with an extra request. Oh, it's more like that. What am I going to do with this? Neither of these is a great reaction. Neither likening the woman to a dog or grumbling as this deaf man needs to be healed. Neither of them is a great reaction, but you know, we are all prone to this. When we're stretched, we may not respond well. I know that my worst moments are when I'm maxed. When I'm feeling really, really maxed, that is when you are likely to not get the best response from me, the response that I'm going to be least proud of after the fact. And I'm guessing that I'm not alone in that. I'm guessing that that's a trait that probably most of us share. But Jesus was still able to help. See, despite the fact that he was clearly not happy with the people finding him, despite the fact that he had been trying to get away, trying to stay in private, trying to stay unrecognized, he was still in a position to help. And because he helped, he was highly regarded by the people. At the end of the story, it says that people were astounded beyond measure, saying, "He has done everything well," which is certainly a comment about the results more than a comment about his language. I think we read the story and we tend to focus on what he says to the Syrophoenician woman. We focus on the fact that he was sighing, that he was not happy when he healed the deaf man, but ultimately, the results were there. Even though he was bothered, even though he was annoyed, he healed the woman's daughter, he healed the deaf man. He still had the space, the ability to actually help, even though doing so ate into that time he was hoping to have to himself. But one of the things that we understand is that when we're overplanned, when the calendar is completely full, it can act as a significant deterrent to our ability to respond in the moment. Sometimes we cross the line from simply being stressed and annoyed to being actually unable to respond to the needs that present themselves in the moment because we have overplanned and overscheduled ourselves. And there's another thing that happens when we do that. When we overplan, when we overschedule, we have to be so focused on accomplishing that next task, on doing that next thing. We're so focused on the next thing that's coming up that we lose sight of the big picture. We can lose sight of what it is that it's all about, of what's really important, because we're so focused on the next little thing, we don't see the big thing. See, in Jesus' interaction with the Syrophoenician woman, she was actually able to remind him of the big picture. See, she answered him. She says, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. Jesus had talked about not throwing the food to the dogs, but she said, even when you feed the children, you end up feeding the dogs. She chose not to respond to the insult. She chose instead to speak to what Jesus was saying. Maybe, I think maybe she sensed how stressed he was in that moment. And she was reminding him, the food goes to everyone. And Jesus is like, you get it. For saying that, the demon has left your daughter. And by the way, when he says for saying that, I don't believe for a moment that if her answer had been different, he wouldn't have healed her daughter. Okay, so don't read that as if the response to her was conditioned on her statement. I don't believe that he's saying that at all. I think he is simply lauding her for having seen the larger truth. The larger truth is that the food that Jesus brought, the spiritual food that Jesus was bringing, was not just going to feed the narrow group, but rather would feed everyone. She saw the big picture, and he was lauding her for having that vision. But we can't see the big picture when we're too caught up in the details. Sometimes we need to take a step back. We need that rest. We need that getting away that Jesus was trying to do. Remember, Jesus would do this so often. He would get away in the Gospels. He would go up a mountain to pray. He would go off by himself to pray. And what is he doing in those moments? He's getting a chance to remember the mission, to remember the reason why he's here, to pray to God, to be reinforced in his larger purpose. And my question is, when do you do that? When do you take a step back to look at the big picture of your life? Because when we're too busy, our vision gets very, very narrow. When I'm really busy, I can only see the task in front of me, and I can't take the interruption. Jesus saw his current task, which he used the analogy of feeding the children with. And she saw the larger task of feeding everyone. So we need to have that time to step back and remind ourselves of the bigger picture, remind ourselves of what it's all about. And that's not something that is done, that's not something that's done to take away from what we're doing. It's not a luxury. It's not anything other than a natural and necessary part of living our lives. I want to give you an analogy, and it's this. How many of you read music? If you do, you recognize immediately what I circled in red. And there's a few of them all through those couple of lines of music. Those are rests. What's a rest? It's where you stop. It's where you don't play. It's where you don't sing. It's where there is silence. But when you look at that all together, what do you think a musician sees? Are the rests any less than the notes? No. Now, if it's all rests, then what you have is John Cage. And that's a musical joke. If you're not familiar with him, John Cage is a very, very avant-garde, modern composer, and he wrote a piece that was simply 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence. There was no music at all, and the idea was that the noise of the people was the music, and that it's become almost a running joke. But no, because, it's not supposed to be all rests. There are notes. But I also can't actually think of any piece of music, right, where it's all notes and no rests. They're a part of the music. It's a part of the song. It's a necessary part of the song. You can't have the piece with no rests at all, it doesn't sound right. Your life isn't right if there are no rests. Your life isn't right if it's all notes and no gaps for too long. And so we need to work on preserving the gaps. I need to work on it. I mean, there's a saying out there that says that preachers often preach the sermon they need to preach to themselves. And I got to confess, this is one I need to preach to myself. But we need to have the gaps. See, we need to decide that our schedule is full before all the gaps are gone. Because it's not a proper sounding life without the rests between the notes. One of the warning signs is what we saw in our passage today. It's getting annoyed. One of the warning signs that you are approaching a schedule that is too full is when you say the less than kind thing. It's when you grumble under your breath. That's the sign that you need to do what Jesus was trying to do, which was get away. And the thing about it is that when you do, you aren't actually doing less, you're actually doing more. Because it's in the gaps that you can actually see beyond your plans. See, when you're in the middle of the busyness, when it's just task after task after task after task, you don't see the big picture. And when you don't see the big picture, you can't think expansively. All you can see is the list of tasks that are in front of you. But in the gaps, you can see what's working. In the gaps, you can adjust to conditions that may be changing in your life. In the gaps, you can see the big picture and evaluate whether the steps that you're taking are actually getting you closer to where it is that you want to be. You see, if your life is going to be a beautiful piece of music, then it's not just a series of notes. It's a series of notes interspersed with rests, interspersed with those places. I mean, think about what a rest does in music. It lets you savor the last note. It lets things come to a silence from which things can build again. It makes the rest of the music possible. This is a holiday weekend. Make sure it is. Most of you have a day off tomorrow. Make sure it is. Let it be the kind of rest that you need in order to complete the song of your life. Amen.